The room was quiet in the way money makes people nervous. Emily Martinez sat upright in a glass-walled office at her bank hands, folded jaw tight, trying to look composed, while the compliance officer scrolled through a screen she couldn't see. Just 48 hours earlier, she had kicked her husband out of their home, told him to leave because he was going nowhere. Because she was tired of carrying a man who couldn't keep up with her life. Now, her joint account was frozen. Several transactions originating from this account triggered automated flags, the officer said calmly. Nothing criminal has been concluded. Yet. Emily exhaled, already forming an explanation, until the officer turned the screen toward her. At the top of the file was a name she knew too well. Brian Martinez. Not listed as a dependent, not as an uninvolved spouse, but as an executive contact tied to multiple regulated crypto entities. Emily laughed under her breath instinctively. "That's impossible," she said. "My husband barely understands." The officer met her eyes. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "are you aware who your husband actually is?" And for the first time since she threw him out, Emily realized something terrifying. She might have never known him at all. Before we go any further, don't leave just yet. Stories like this unfold slowly, and every detail matters. If you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, drop your location and local time in the comments. And if you believe integrity still counts when money enters a marriage, consider subscribing. This story is about choices and the cost of underestimating the quiet ones. Brian Martinez had never looked poor to himself. That assumption had always belonged to other people. To Brian, his life made sense in a quiet, orderly way. He woke up at 6:10 every morning without an alarm. He drank his coffee black. He wore the same style of clothes, plain button-down shirts, clean jeans, neutral jackets, not because he couldn't afford better, but because he disliked distraction. He believed attention was expensive. Once you attracted it, you paid for it forever. Emily never saw it that way. When they first met, Brian's restraint felt grounding. He listened more than he spoke. He never competed for the spotlight. He remembered details: her father's health issues, the anxiety she hid behind jokes, the ambition she was afraid to admit out loud. Back then, his calm felt like strength. But time has a way of turning virtues into inconveniences. Emily's career moved faster than Brian's visible progress. She worked in business operations, a role that lived and died by perception, how you spoke, who you knew, how your life looked from the outside. Promotions didn't come only from performance. They came from dinners, conferences, conversations that started after hours with the right people holding the right glasses of wine. Brian didn't attend those things. He declined politely every time. He said crowds drained him. He said he preferred evenings at home. He said he was working on long-term projects that didn't need public validation. To Emily, that answer slowly became unbearable. At first, she defended him. "He's private," she told her friends. "Not everyone needs to climb the same ladder." Then the tone shifted. "Well, he's different," she'd say, forcing a laugh. "He's simple." Eventually, she stopped defending him at all. The comparisons crept in without asking permission. Emily noticed the way her co-workers' husbands dressed: tailored suits, confident posture, loud laughter that filled rooms. She noticed how easily they spoke about investments, exits, property, things that sounded solid and impressive. When those men asked Brian what he did, he answered with vague honesty. "I consult," he'd say. "Systems, security." And then he'd stop talking. People didn't push. Silence made them uncomfortable. Silence, they assumed, meant emptiness. At home, Emily started asking sharper questions. "Are you ever going to move up?" she asked one night while scrolling through her phone. Brian looked up from his laptop. "Move up where?" "You know what I mean," she said. "A title, a direction, something people can understand." Brian considered this. "I'm exactly where I need to be." That answer ended the conversation, but not the resentment. Money became the unspoken measure of everything. Emily tracked it carefully. She knew what came in. She knew what went out. Brian contributed consistently, but without explanation. His deposits arrived like clockwork, always enough, never flashy. No bonuses, no sudden spikes. To Emily, it felt suspicious in the most boring way possible. She began to believe he lacked ambition. Worse, she believed he was comfortable being carried. The idea humiliated her. She told herself she was being practical, realistic, grown up. Love, after all, wasn't supposed to mean settling. Brian noticed the shift long before she spoke it out loud. He saw it in the way Emily stopped asking about his day, in the way she no longer waited for him before eating, in how her phone became more important than their shared silence on the couch. He recognized the signs not because he was emotionally fragile, but because he had trained himself to observe systems under stress. And their marriage was under stress. Still, he didn't panic. He didn't confront her. He believed pressure revealed character, and that truth, when forced, often arrived cruelly. He hoped patience might soften whatever had hardened inside her. It didn't. The distance between them widened quietly without drama. Emily began staying late at work. She dressed differently, sharper, more deliberate. Her laughter changed too. It came home with her, sometimes borrowed from rooms Brian had never entered. The first time Brian sensed something more than emotional distance was the night he found the second phone missing from his car. It was a small device, encrypted, paid for in cash, never used at home. Brian rarely thought about it. It existed as a precaution, nothing more. But when he reached into the glove compartment and felt only empty space, something tightened in his chest. He didn't confront Emily. He watched. 2 days later, she asked him a question that confirmed what he already feared. "Why do you have 2 phones?" she said casually, not looking at him. Brian paused. "Why were you in my car?" Emily shrugged. "I needed to grab something." Silence followed. "Work-related," Brian added evenly. Emily smiled, thin and polite. "Of course it is." From that moment on, she stopped pretending. Her disappointment turned sharper. Her comments turned crueler, though never outright abusive. She mastered the art of diminishing him with tone alone. "You wouldn't get it. It's complicated. You live in your own little world, Brian." He absorbed it without protest, not because he believed it, but because he understood something Emily didn't. She thought his silence meant ignorance. In truth, it was restraint. Brian had spent years building systems that survived scrutiny. He knew how quickly information became weaponized once exposed to the wrong motivations. He had seen relationships implode under the weight of sudden power. He had promised himself that if he ever built something valuable, he would protect it and the people around him from its consequences. That promise was now being tested. Emily, meanwhile, was building a different narrative. To her friends, Brian was sweet but stagnant. To her co-workers, he was nice but not driven. And eventually, to herself, he became an obstacle, something she had outgrown. She didn't realize she was wrong about one crucial thing. Brian wasn't standing still. He was standing back. And the space she mistook for emptiness was filled with decisions he had already made, decisions that would matter very soon. Nathan Cole entered Emily Martinez's life the way influence often does, without urgency, without spectacle, and without asking permission. He didn't arrive as temptation. He arrived as validation. Nathan was the kind of executive who never announced his authority. He didn't raise his voice in meetings. He didn't dress loudly. His confidence lived in the pauses between sentences, in the way people waited for him to finish speaking before they responded. At 46, he had already exited 2 ventures, sat on 3 advisory boards, and carried himself like a man who had nothing left to prove and everything left to acquire. Emily noticed him before he noticed her. At first, it was professional. Nathan asked thoughtful questions during cross-functional meetings. He remembered her suggestions and referenced them weeks later, crediting her by name. When others spoke over her, he gently redirected the conversation back. "I want to hear Emily finish her thought," he would say. That sentence did more for her than any raise ever had. Soon he began looping her into conversations that extended beyond her job description. Strategy discussions, off-the-record insights, the kind of information that made you feel chosen. When she hesitated, he smiled in a way that felt reassuring, not predatory. "You're sharper than you give yourself credit for," he told her once after a late meeting. "Don't shrink yourself to fit a role someone else defined." Emily went home that night lighter than she had in months. Brian noticed immediately, not because she told him, but because energy is harder to hide than words. Emily moved through the apartment differently. She hummed while getting ready. She smiled at her phone. She talked more about long-term positioning and visibility concepts she hadn't mentioned before. Brian listened. He asked neutral questions. He said he was happy she felt seen. It was true. But happiness didn't cancel awareness. Nathan's invitations followed a pattern. First coffee, then team dinners, then industry mixers where Emily was introduced not as support staff but as someone you should know. At these events, Nathan never stood too close. He never touched her arm. He never crossed a line that could be easily named. Instead, he stood back and let contrast do the work. He talked about risk tolerance, about timing markets, about how wealth wasn't built through salary. It was built through leverage, patience, and information. Emily listened hungry, nodding along, absorbing a world she felt she had been circling but never allowed into. When someone asked about her husband, she hesitated. "He's private," she said. Nathan didn't react. That too felt intentional. "Privacy can be powerful," he replied. "Or it can be a shield people hide behind." The sentence lingered. At home, Emily's patience with Brian thinned. His routines felt smaller now, almost insulting in their predictability. While she was expanding learning, networking, positioning, he seemed content to remain invisible. She asked him one evening halfway through dinner, "Do you ever think about doing more?" Brian looked up. "More of what?" "More of everything," she said. Frustration seeping through her voice. More ambition, more presence, more forward motion. Brian studied her carefully. "You think motion only moves in one direction?" Emily scoffed. "It moves towards something. That's the point." He didn't argue. He rarely did anymore. The first time Brian and Nathan were in the same room was at a company holiday reception. The venue was elegant, but restrained glass steel soft lighting meant to imply taste rather than extravagance. Nathan shook Brian's hand firmly, his smile measured. "So you're the mysterious husband," he said lightly. "Emily speaks highly of you." That wasn't true. But Emily didn't correct him. Brian returned the smile. "I try to stay out of the way." Nathan's eyes flickered just for a moment. "Interesting philosophy," he said. They exchanged a few polite sentences, weather, work, generalities. Then Nathan mentioned something that made Brian's posture shift almost imperceptibly. "We're seeing more conversations around institutional crypto custody lately," Nathan said, as if speaking casually. "Most people don't realize how much infrastructure sits behind the scenes." Emily didn't notice Brian's reaction. Brian did. The phrasing wasn't something you picked up from headlines. It wasn't cocktail talk. It was precise, too precise for someone merely dabbling. Nathan watched Brian as he spoke, measuring something, then quickly moved on. The moment passed. But Brian felt the internal calculation begin. At home later that night, Emily was restless. She paced while Brian cleaned up. She talked about the event, about the people she met, about how refreshing it felt to be around those who thought bigger. "And Nathan," she added casually, "he gets it. He understands the kind of life I want." Brian paused at the sink. "What kind is that?" Emily hesitated, then shrugged. "A life that doesn't feel limited." The word landed between them like a verdict. Brian dried his hands slowly. "Limitations aren't always what they seem." Emily sighed. "You always say things like that, because they're often true." She turned to him sharply. "Or because they're safe. You hide behind philosophy instead of taking risks." Brian met her gaze calm but firm. "You don't know what risks I've taken." That surprised her. For someone who avoids attention, she said, "You're awfully confident, you're right." Brian didn't respond. He returned to his routine. The conversation ended unresolved, as so many did now. Emily interpreted his silence the way she had learned to. avoidance, weakness, fear. Nathan, meanwhile, increased his presence subtly. He praised Emily's insights publicly. He began mentoring her privately. He spoke about opportunity in a way that felt inevitable rather than hypothetical. "You're standing on the edge of something," he told her during a late office conversation. "The question is whether you're willing to step forward or let someone else decide your limits for you." Emily thought of Brian when he said that. She didn't realize Nathan was also thinking of Brian, but for very different reasons. He had recognized something at that reception, a familiarity with language, a reaction too controlled to be accidental. Nathan had spent enough time around real power to know when it was being intentionally concealed. And concealed power, he knew, was either dangerous or exploitable. As Emily drifted further into Nathan's orbit, Brian began preparing quietly. He reviewed patterns. He archived communications. He noted shifts in Emily's behavior, not with resentment, but with the detached precision of someone who understood that systems fail gradually, then suddenly. Nathan believed he was guiding Emily toward a bigger life. Emily believed she was outgrowing her husband. Brian understood something neither of them did yet. This was no longer about ambition. It was about leverage. And the first move had already been made. The first change Emily made felt reasonable. She told herself that as she logged into their joint account late one night, the glow of her laptop painting the kitchen walls a pale blue. Brian was asleep. He always slept deeply after long days, as if rest were something he trusted completely. Emily envied that. She changed the password. Not because she planned to do anything wrong, at least that was how she framed it, but because she wanted control. Nathan had mentioned it casually during a conversation about financial hygiene, the way executives talked about risk, the same way others talked about weather. "Shared access is efficient," he'd said, stirring his coffee, "but it can blur accountability. At some point, someone needs to own the decisions." Emily liked how that sounded. Ownership, authority. The next morning, Brian noticed the email alert. He didn't mention it. Over the next few weeks, Emily's adjustments multiplied. She opened a new checking account in her name for expenses. She applied for a credit card with better points. She shifted their subscriptions. None of it was dramatic. None of it was illegal. It was the kind of financial rearranging millions of couples did every day, except Emily wasn't rearranging with Brian. She was doing it around him. Brian noticed the changes in patterns long before he saw them on statements. Groceries came from different stores. Utilities were paid early or late instead of on schedule. Deposits moved with slightly altered timing. To most people, it would have looked like nothing. To Brian, it looked like someone testing boundaries. He asked her about it gently one evening while they sat on opposite ends of the couch, the television murmuring between them. "Did you change the banking login?" he asked, eyes still on the screen. Emily stiffened. "Why, no reason," he said. "Just got an alert." She rolled her eyes. "I'm trying to streamline things. You never care about this stuff anyway." Brian turned to look at her. "I care. I just don't micromanage." "Well," she said sharply, "someone has to manage. Things don't just take care of themselves." The accusation hung there unspoken but heavy. Brian nodded once. "Let me know if you need anything." She took that as permission. Nathan's influence grew bolder. He began sending Emily spreadsheets, hypothetical projections, he called them. Nothing directly tied to him, nothing traceable. Just suggestions. Better ways to position cash. Ways to avoid idle money. "You're leaving value on the table," he told her during a late call. "Cash should work for you." Emily wanted to believe that Brian's steady deposits were small because he earned small. The alternative, that he was intentionally limiting visibility, felt absurd. Why would anyone do that? She began moving money. Not much at first. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. Transfers to accounts Nathan's advisor recommended. The language was always clean consulting fees, strategic allocations, temporary placements. Emily trusted paperwork. It looked official. It always did. Brian received the first automated fraud alert 2 weeks later. It wasn't dramatic, just a standard email. Unrecognized device logged into your account. He closed his laptop slowly. That night, he didn't sleep. He replayed conversations in his mind with a calm detachment of someone assembling a timeline. Emily's sudden confidence, Nathan's phrasing at the reception, the paperwork Emily never showed him, the money moving without discussion. He wasn't angry. He was concerned, because he recognized the shape of what was forming not from paranoia, but from experience. Financial manipulation rarely announced itself. It presented as empowerment, as progress, as intelligence. The next morning, Brian asked again. "Some transfers went out," he said while pouring coffee. "Can you walk me through them?" Emily didn't look up. "I'm optimizing things." "For what purpose?" she sighed. "You wouldn't understand. It's business." Brian's voice remained even. "I understand business." She laughed, short and dismissive. "You consult on systems, Brian. This is strategy." The word stung not because it was insulting, but because it was inaccurate. Brian chose his next sentence carefully. "Are these transfers tied to Nathan?" Emily froze. Then she turned on him. "Why are you tracking me?" "I'm not tracking you," he said. "I'm asking." Her face flushed. "This is exactly why I needed control. You always question. You never trust." Brian stared at her, surprised by the reversal. "Trust isn't the absence of questions." Emily stood. "I don't have time for this. I'm late." She left without another word. Brian sat alone at the table, the untouched coffee cooling in front of him. He felt the familiar pull of instinct, an internal alert that something had crossed from uncomfortable into unsafe. That afternoon, he contacted Daniel Ross. They didn't meet in person. They never did at first. Daniel preferred encrypted calls and limited exposure habits formed from years of untangling financial disasters that began exactly like this. "Walk me through what you're seeing," Daniel said after Brian finished outlining the changes. "Gradual consolidation of access," Brian replied. "Unilateral transfers, third-party advisors with no clear fiduciary trail." Daniel was silent for a moment. "Is she aware of regulatory exposure?" Brian closed his eyes. "No, that's a problem," Daniel said carefully, "especially if the money touches anything crypto-adjacent." Brian exhaled. "It will." Daniel didn't ask how Brian knew. "What do you want me to do?" Daniel asked. "Monitor," Brian said. "Document. Don't intervene yet." "You're sure?" "Yes." Because intervening too early only drove people deeper into denial. Emily, meanwhile, felt powerful. For the first time in months, she felt ahead of her life, rather than chasing it. Nathan praised her decisiveness. He talked about the future as if it were already hers. Bigger roles, smarter money-cleaner exits. "You're not like most people," he told her during a late-night message. "You're willing to act." She read that sentence twice before replying. At home, the tension became visible. Brian grew quieter, not withdrawn, but focused. He spent more time at his desk. He stopped asking questions. Emily took that as surrender. "See," she told herself, "he's finally letting go." But Brian wasn't letting go. He was letting the pattern complete itself. The final transfer happened on a Friday afternoon. It was larger than the others. Large enough to trigger a cascade of automated reviews. Large enough to leave a trail Emily didn't know existed. Brian received the notification on his secure phone. He stared at the amount, then at the destination account. His jaw tightened not with rage, but with certainty. He sent one message to Daniel. "It's crossed the threshold." Daniel replied seconds later. "Understood. Preserve everything." That evening, Brian sat across from Emily at dinner, the space between them filled with unspoken truths. He wanted to warn her. He wanted to stop it. He wanted to protect her from the consequences she didn't see coming. But protection without consent was control, and he refused to become that man. Instead, he said quietly, "If you're moving money, you need to be careful." Emily smiled, thin and confident. "I am," Brian nodded. "Then I hope you know who you're trusting." She didn't answer. Because if she had, she might have noticed the question wasn't about jealousy. It was about liability. And the system she was stepping into did not forgive ignorance. Emily didn't mean to follow Brian. The decision happened the way many consequential ones do, quietly, impulsively wrapped in justification. Brian had left the apartment earlier than usual that morning, jacket on, phone already to his ear. Not the one she recognized, not the one he left on the counter every night. That detail lingered. Emily told herself she was curious, not suspicious. Curiosity sounded harmless, reasonable. She waited 10 minutes, then grabbed her keys. Brian drove calmly, predictably. No sudden turns, no evasive behavior. That more than anything unsettled her. If he were hiding something shameful, an affair, a second job, some embarrassing side hustle, she expected nervous energy. Instead, he drove like a man, exactly where he intended to be. He pulled into a low-profile building tucked between a medical supply company and a quiet legal office. No signage announcing innovation, no polished lobby, just concrete-tinted glass and a discreet security camera mounted above the door. Emily parked across the street. From a distance, the building looked unremarkable. Too unremarkable. The kind of place you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. Brian exited his car, scanned his surroundings with habitual awareness, then entered using a key card. That was the first detail that didn't fit. Emily stayed in her car, heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. She leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, trying to decode what she'd just seen. Brian didn't have access cards, not to anything important. At least, that's what she believed. She stepped out and crossed the street, pretending to check her phone. Up close, she noticed the glass door wasn't just tinted, it was reinforced. And etched faintly into the corner, almost invisible, unless you knew what to look for, was a small symbol. Not a company logo, a compliance marker. Emily didn't recognize it consciously, but it stirred something in her memory. Training modules, risk seminars. The kind of thing you glanced at and forgot because it never applied to you. She snapped a photo before she could stop herself. Back in her car, she sat there longer than planned, waiting for someone to confirm the story she had already written in her head. That Brian was lying. That he was wasting time. That she was right to move on. But the story refused to solidify. Brian didn't emerge quickly. He didn't sneak out. He stayed inside for nearly 2 hours. Emily drove to work unsettled, her confidence shaken by a building she couldn't explain. The image followed her through meetings, through emails, through Nathan's easy reassurances about momentum and next steps. When she mentioned it casually during lunch, just enough to sound unconcerned, Nathan's reaction was almost imperceptible. Almost. "A building near Westlake," he asked, spoon pausing midair. Emily nodded. "Nothing fancy. Kind of quiet." Nathan smiled. "A lot of important things are quiet." The answer sounded wise. It was supposed to. But something in his tone made Emily uneasy. He didn't ask more questions. He didn't seem surprised. If anything, he looked thoughtful, calculating. That afternoon, Emily did something she'd never done before. She searched Brian's name, not casually, thoroughly. She didn't expect to find much. Maybe a LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated in years, a generic consulting page, something that would confirm her assumptions. Instead, she found almost nothing. No interviews, no panels, no public credentials beyond the bare minimum. For a man in his mid-30s working in systems and security, the absence was strange. Professionals usually left traces, papers, conference mentions, at least a digital footprint. Brian's was curated. The realization unsettled her more than evidence of failure would have. That night, she asked him directly. "Where do you go on Fridays?" she said over dinner. Brian didn't flinch. "Work. What kind?" "The kind that requires focus." She set her fork down. "I followed you today." Brian looked at her then. Not angry, not shocked, just attentive. And he asked. "You went to a building with no sign," she said. "With security, with compliance markings." A pause. "That's not a question," Brian said. Emily leaned forward. What are you hiding? Brian studied her face as if weighing something carefully. I'm not hiding, he said. I'm containing. She scoffed. You always talk like that, in riddles. It's exhausting. Clarity isn't always kind, Brian replied. Emily's voice rose. You think I can't handle the truth? Brian didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was steady. I think timing matters. That infuriated her. Timing, she repeated. You don't get to decide when I deserve honesty. Brian nodded slowly. You're right. The admission disarmed her. But he continued, you also don't get to move money. You don't fully understand and call it progress. Her eyes flashed. So now you're monitoring me. I'm warning you. I don't need warnings, she snapped. I need a partner who doesn't make me feel small. The sentence cut deeper than she intended. Brian absorbed it quietly. I've never tried to make you small. Emily stood. You don't have to try. You just are. She walked away, leaving the table untouched. That night, Brian didn't sleep. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew the system had reached a critical point. Emily's curiosity had turned into suspicion. Her suspicion was feeding insecurity. And insecurity, when mixed with external influence, became dangerous. He contacted Laura Bennett before dawn. We're past prevention, he said. We're in exposure. Laura listened carefully. Is she aware of the risk she's creating for herself? No. And the third party? Very aware. Laura exhaled. Then you need to start protecting yourself. I am, Brian said. I just don't want to destroy her in the process. Silence on the line. That may not be a choice you get to make, Laura replied gently. The next morning, Emily received an email that shifted everything. It was from her bank. Routine language, polite tone. A request for clarification regarding a recent transfer and the associated advisory entity. Her stomach dropped. She forwarded it to Nathan immediately. Is this normal? The reply didn't come right away. When it did, it was brief. Don't respond yet. Let me handle it. That should have reassured her. Instead, it made her cold. Emily stared at the screen, then at Brian across the kitchen, calmly packing his lunch like any other day. She wondered for the first time whether she had mistaken silence for weakness and confidence for safety. Brian zipped his bag and looked up. You should talk to a lawyer, he said quietly. Emily laughed sharp and brittle. You're threatening me now. No, he said. I'm giving you the last warning I can. She shook her head, anger overriding doubt. You're afraid because you're losing control. Brian met her gaze. I never had control. That afternoon, Emily made the decision she would later wish she had paused on. She authorized another transfer. It was meant to secure her future. Instead, it completed a pattern that systems were designed to notice. Brian saw it the moment it happened. He didn't confront her. He didn't argue. He picked up his phone and sent a single message. Proceed. Daniel's reply came instantly. Understood. Regulators will notice this within hours. Brian set the phone down and stared out the window. The smallest details always mattered most. Not the dramatic gestures, not the loud betrayals, just the quiet confirmations that told a system exactly what it needed to know. Emily thought she had discovered Brian's secret. She didn't realize she had just revealed her own. The night Emily told Brian to leave did not begin with anger. It began with applause. The company gala was held downtown in a hotel ballroom designed to look understated and expensive. Muted gold lighting, minimalist floral arrangements, a live jazz trio playing softly near the bar. It was the kind of event meant to signal arrival without ever saying the word. Emily had waited years to feel like she belonged in rooms like this. Tonight she did. Nathan Cole moved through the crowd with practiced ease, stopping to greet board members, investors, senior managers. When he reached Emily, he placed a hand lightly at the small of her back, brief enough to remain appropriate, familiar enough to be noticed. You did well today, he said, leaning close. The numbers landed exactly the way we needed. Emily smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. She hadn't seen Brian all evening. He'd declined to come, citing a deadline. She told herself she was relieved. As the night wore on, the conversations sharpened. Wine loosened tongues. Someone joked about dead weight at home. Another woman laughed about outgrowing her first marriage. Emily laughed too, just a little late, just a little too hard. When a colleague asked casually, "So what does your husband do again?" Emily hesitated. "He consults," she said. Nathan, standing beside her, took a sip of his drink. "Some people prefer to stay comfortable," he said mildly. "Others choose growth." Emily felt the sentence settle into her bones. On the drive home, the city lights blurred past the windshield. Emily replayed the night in fragments, compliments, laughter, the way people leaned in when Nathan spoke. Then she imagined Brian at home, quiet, invisible cunt, with a life that suddenly felt impossibly small. The thought ignited something sharp and volatile. Brian was at the kitchen table when she arrived. Laptop open, a mug of tea cooling beside him. He looked up as she entered. "How was it?" he asked. "Don't," she said, dropping her purse. "Don't do that calm thing right now." Brian closed the laptop slowly. "What happened?" She laughed, a brittle, humorless sound. "What happened is, I'm tired. I'm tired of explaining you. I'm tired of pretending we're moving forward when we're standing still." Brian stood. "Emily, no," she interrupted. "You don't get to soften this. I've spent years shrinking myself so you wouldn't feel threatened." "And for what?" Brian felt something settle in his chest. "Not surprise, recognition. You've never shrunk yourself for me," he said evenly. She shook her head. "You don't even hear it. That's the problem." Her words came faster now, fueled by everything she'd held back. "Everyone else is building something. Everyone else is taking risks. And you," she gestured helplessly. "You hide, you disappear. You make me feel like I'm dragging us both forward alone." Brian listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He had learned long ago that arguments rarely change conclusions people had already reached. "I met someone tonight," Emily continued. "Someone who sees what I could be. Someone who isn't afraid of growth." Brian met her eyes. "Is that what this is about?" She hesitated just a fraction of a second. Then she hardened. "This is about me choosing better." The silence that followed felt final. "Pack your things," Emily said. "I need space. Real space." Brian nodded once. "Tonight, yes." He didn't argue. He turned toward the bedroom. As he packed, he moved with deliberate care. Clothes folded neatly, personal items placed methodically into a small suitcase. He left behind anything that felt symbolic: books they'd bought together, framed photos, shared mementos. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. Emily stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. Some part of her expected him to fight, to beg, to rage. He did none of those things. When he reached for his jacket, he paused. "There's something you need to hear," Brian said quietly. Emily scoffed. "This isn't the time." "It is," he replied. She sighed dramatically. "Fine." What? Brian met her gaze. His voice remained calm, but there was a weight to it she hadn't heard before. "If you keep moving money the way you have been," he said, "you need to stop. Not tomorrow. Not after talking to anyone else. Now." Emily laughed. "You're giving me financial advice now. I'm warning you," he said. "Because once certain thresholds are crossed, systems don't care about intent." Her smile faded. "You don't get to scare me because you're losing control." "I never had control," Brian said softly. "I had responsibility." Emily shook her head, exasperated. "You're unbelievable. You really think you're smarter than everyone else in the room." Brian picked up his bag. "I think you're trusting someone who benefits from you not asking questions." "That's rich," she snapped, "coming from the man who won't answer any." Brian walked to the door, then stopped. "I didn't tell you everything," he said without turning around, "because I was protecting us. But protection only works when both people are acting in good faith." Emily's voice was sharp. "Don't put this on me." "I'm not," he replied. "I'm putting it where it belongs." He opened the door. As he stepped into the hallway, Emily felt a flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, or fear. She crushed it quickly. "You'll regret this," she called after him. Brian paused just once. "I already regret not realizing sooner how far apart we'd grown," he said. "But I don't regret leaving now." The door closed behind him with a soft final click. Emily stood alone in the apartment, heart-racing adrenaline, still buzzing through her veins. She told herself she felt free, that this was necessary, that tomorrow everything would feel lighter. Instead, the silence pressed in. She checked her phone. No new messages from Nathan. She told herself that meant nothing. Across town, Brian checked into a modest extended-stay hotel. The room was clean, anonymous, exactly what he needed. He sat on the edge of the bed, suitcase still unopened, and let the weight of the moment settle. He wasn't broken. He was resolved. He took out his secure phone and dialed Laura Bennett. "She asked me to leave," he said simply. Laura didn't sound surprised. "Are you safe?" "Yes. Did you warn her I did?" Laura exhaled. "Then you've done what you can." Brian stared at the blank wall. "I don't want to hurt her," I know, Laura said gently, "but intent won't stop consequences." After the call, Brian contacted Daniel Ross. "It's escalated," he said. "Personal separation, financial exposure continuing." Daniel didn't hesitate. "Then we move from observation to containment." "Yes," Brian agreed. "But keep it clean, by the book." "That's the only way this ends well," Daniel replied. Brian lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The path ahead was clear now, even if it wasn't easy. Emily had made her choice publicly, decisively. What she didn't understand yet was that systems once engaged didn't respond to emotion. They responded to evidence. And the evidence was no longer on her side. Brian Martinez did not wake up the next morning feeling abandoned. He woke up feeling alert. The extended-stay hotel room was quiet in a way that felt temporary, neutral, no shared memories clinging to the walls, no emotional residue embedded in the furniture. Brian appreciated that. He showered, dressed, and sat at the small desk by the window, with his laptop open before most of the city had fully woken up. This was not a retreat. It was a reset. At 7:12 a.m., he joined a secure video call with Laura Bennett. Her background was characteristically sparse law books, neutral walls, no personal photos. "Walk me through exactly what changed last night," she said. "She asked me to leave," Brian replied. "And she's continuing unilateral financial activity tied to a third party." Laura nodded slowly. "Then we're officially past informal resolution." "I know," Brian said. "But I don't want escalation for its own sake," good Laura replied. "Because escalation without structure gets messy. What we need is protection." Brian leaned back slightly. "Asset containment and documentation," Laura added. "If she's acting under influence or pressure, we need to establish when that started and who benefits." Brian didn't hesitate. "Nathan Cole." Laura's eyes sharpened. "Then we treat him as a variable, not an accusation. No emotion, just facts." That afternoon, Brian met Daniel Ross in person for the first time. Daniel chose the location, a quiet co-working space with neutral lighting and no visible branding. He was methodical by nature, his demeanor more academic than confrontational. "I'm going to say something uncomfortable," Daniel began once they sat down. "Your wife may not understand what she's done, but the systems she's touching don't care." Brian nodded. "I'm aware." "Then the question becomes," Daniel continued, "do you want to shield her or preserve yourself?" Brian considered this carefully. "I want to do both if possible." Daniel studied him. "That's rare." Brian didn't respond. They spent the next 2 hours reconstructing timelines. Daniel projected transaction maps on his screen, showing how Emily's transfers moved through layers, accounts, advisory entities, temporary holdings. None of it screamed criminal on its own. Together, it told a story of influence and exposure. "She's not the architect," Daniel said. "She's the conduit." "That's what worries me," Brian replied. "Conduits get burned." Daniel nodded. especially when regulators arrive. They agreed on a strategy that prioritized restraint. No sudden freezes, no confrontations. Just preservation of evidence and readiness for legal action if and when external systems intervened. By the time Brian returned to the hotel, his phone buzzed. "Emily, we need to talk." Brian stared at the message for several seconds before responding. "I agree, but not privately." There was a pause. "What does that mean?" "It means with legal counsel present." The reply came faster this time. "You're overreacting," Brian typed slowly. "I warned you. This is where we are now." He put the phone down and didn't wait for her response. Across town, Emily was unraveling. The apartment felt wrong without Brian. Too open, too loud in its silence. She tried to focus on work, but her thoughts kept circling back to the bank email, to Nathan's delayed responses, to the building she'd followed Brian to, the one that still didn't make sense. She met Nathan that evening, seeking reassurance. "This is just noise," he said smoothly. "Compliance departments love paperwork. It'll pass." "What about Brian?" Emily asked. "He's acting like this is serious." Nathan's expression hardened briefly before smoothing over. "He's trying to intimidate you. Don't let him." "Why would he?" she pressed. Nathan smiled thinly. "Because he's losing you." The answer felt insufficient. Back at the hotel, Brian prepared documents late into the night, not because he needed to, but because focus calmed him. He organized files, encrypted backups, logged timestamps. Every step he took was deliberate, designed to leave a trail that spoke for itself. At 11:46 p.m., Laura emailed, "I've filed for a temporary financial restraining order to prevent further unilateral transfers. This is standard protection, not an accusation." Brian read it twice, then replied, "Thank you. Keep it narrow." He knew what that filing would do. It wouldn't freeze Emily's life, but it would alert institutions that something was being disputed. It would slow things down. And slowing things down was sometimes the only way to prevent irreversible damage. The next morning, Emily received the notice. She stared at the document, hands shaking. A legal action against her. She called Brian immediately. "You went to a lawyer?" she demanded when he answered. "Yes," Brian said calmly. "You're trying to trap me." "No," he replied. "I'm trying to keep you from being trapped by someone else." "That's absurd." "Is it?" Brian asked. "Because the order doesn't accuse you of anything. It just stops more damage." Emily's voice rose. "You're making me look guilty." "I'm making the system pause," Brian said. "There's a difference." She hung up on him. Nathan was less calm when she showed him the notice. "This complicates things," he said flatly. "Complicates what?" Emily asked. He hesitated, just long enough. Emily felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Meanwhile, subpoenas were being prepared, not to accuse, but to request. Paperwork that asked quiet questions and waited patiently for answers. Questions about advisory relationships, about authorization, about who stood to gain. Brian didn't celebrate this phase. He endured it. Every step forward carried weight. Every decision risked harm to Emily, to himself, to people who didn't yet know that they were connected to this unraveling. Late one evening, Daniel called. "Regulators have noticed the pattern," he said. "Not formally, but they're watching." Brian closed his eyes. "Then it's out of our hands." "Mostly," Daniel agreed. "But how this ends still depends on choices." Brian thought of Emily, of who she had been before ambition turned corrosive, of the person she might still be if given a chance to step away before the collapse. He sent her one final message that night. "I'm not your enemy, but I won't shield lies mine or anyone else's." She didn't reply. The distance between them had become more than physical. It was procedural now, legal, structural. And once relationships entered that realm, emotion stopped being the driver. Evidence did. Brian understood that better than anyone, because while Emily believed he had finally chosen to fight her, he had actually chosen to stop fighting himself. Nathan Cole did not panic when Emily showed him the notice, at least not outwardly. He read the document slowly, his expression neutral, fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, as if grounding himself. The cafe around them buzzed with low conversation and clinking cups, but a subtle tension settled between them that Emily could feel in her chest. "This is procedural," Nathan said at last. "Not an accusation?" "That's what Brian said," Emily replied, watching him carefully. Nathan smiled. "Then for once we agree." But something in his tone had changed. The warmth was thinner now, the reassurance more deliberate, like a man choosing words not for comfort, but for control. "This happens when people get emotional during separations," he continued. "Lawyers love paper shields. It makes clients feel protected." Emily nodded, though unease lingered. "He's acting like I've done something wrong." "You haven't," Nathan said smoothly. "You've taken initiative. That scares people who don't understand leverage." Leverage. The word still thrilled her. It made her feel powerful and formed ahead of the curve. Nathan had a way of framing decisions so that they felt inevitable, less like choices, more like progress unfolding naturally. Still, Emily hesitated. The order pauses transfers. Everything slowed down. Nathan leaned back, studying her. "That's temporary. What matters is positioning." He slid a folder across the table. "What's this?" Emily asked. "A formal advisory agreement," he replied. "It simplifies things, centralizes decision-making. It protects you from looking like the primary actor." She flipped through the pages. Dense language, legal phrasing, sections highlighted in pale yellow. "Do I need to read all this?" she asked. Nathan chuckled softly. "It's boilerplate. But if it helps, this clause here allows us to act on your behalf. It's cleaner, especially now." Emily paused. "Act on my behalf, how transaction authority," he said casually. "Strategic discretion." The words sounded safe, professional. "What about liability?" she asked, surprising herself. Nathan's eyes flickered just for a second. "Shared, but managed." He tapped a paragraph near the back. "This part indemnifies you." Emily skimmed it, heart beating faster. Indemnify, hold harmless. The phrases blurred together. She trusted contracts. She had signed dozens in her career. Nathan had never given her a reason not to. She signed. Across town, Brian Martinez felt the shift the moment it happened. Not emotionally, technically. An automated alert appeared on his secure dashboard, flagging a change in authorization tied to Emily's financial profile. It wasn't a transfer. It was worse. A delegation. He stared at the screen, then leaned back in his chair. Daniel Ross was already calling. "She signed an advisory authorization," Daniel said without preamble. "Broad scope. Too broad." Brian closed his eyes. "Nathan?" "Yes." "Is it enforceable?" Daniel exhaled. "Parts of it. Enough to complicate things." Brian nodded. "Document everything." "We are," Daniel said. "But Brian, this moves her from conduit to cover." Brian's jaw tightened. "She doesn't know." "No," Daniel agreed. "But the system won't care." That evening, Emily felt lighter. Signing the agreement gave her a sense of relief, like handing off a burden she hadn't realized was crushing her. Nathan reassured her again. This was smart, protective adult. "You've done the right thing," he said. "Now let me handle the noise." She wanted to believe him. At home, the apartment still felt wrong. Brian's absence echoed in small ways, the extra space in the closet, the silence during meals. Emily told herself it was temporary discomfort. Growth always hurt, didn't it? Her phone buzzed. "Brian, did you sign something today?" Her pulse spiked. Why, she typed. "Because a delegation just hit the system." She hesitated, then responded defensively. "I'm allowed to manage my own finances." "Yes," Brian replied. "But you just gave someone else the keys." Emily stared at the screen, anger flaring. "You don't trust me." "I don't trust him," Brian wrote. "And now neither should you." She threw the phone onto the couch, frustration boiling over. Brian always did this, spoke in warnings, never explanations. He expected her to believe him without evidence. Nathan, by contrast, showed her paperwork. The next morning, Emily received another email. this one from her company's internal audit team. Routine inquiry, standard language. A request for clarification regarding a potential conflict of interest. Her hands shook as she read it. She forwarded it to Nathan immediately. Minutes passed. Then an hour. When he finally replied, the message was different from before. Don't respond directly. Forward everything to me. That didn't reassure her. At lunch, Emily tried to reach him by phone, voicemail. She told herself he was busy. By late afternoon, the weight in her chest had grown heavy enough to slow her breathing. She reread the advisory agreement she'd signed this time more carefully. The highlighted sections blurred less now. One clause stood out. Client acknowledges full responsibility for authorized actions undertaken on her behalf. Her stomach dropped. She called Brian. I think I made a mistake, she said the moment he answered. Brian didn't sound surprised. Tell me what you signed, she explained, voice-tight shame creeping in with every word. When she finished, there was a long pause on the line. That document shifts risk, Brian said finally. Not away from you, onto you. Emily swallowed. Can we undo it? Not easily, he replied, and not without consequences. Tears burned behind her eyes. Why didn't you tell me everything before Brian's voice softened? Because you weren't listening. And because once I said it out loud, it would change how people treated you. She laughed bitterly. It's changing anyway. Yes, he said, but now we can respond. What do I do? She asked. First, Brian said, stop signing anything. Second, the line cut out. Emily stared at her phone, panic rising. Across town, Brian looked at the screen confused. Daniel's number flashed next. Brian Daniels said urgently, regulators just issued preliminary inquiries. Quiet ones. But they're real? Brian closed his eyes. Timing now. Nathan's office lights went dark earlier than usual that night. Emily drove past without stopping, heart pounding, the city suddenly unfamiliar. She felt exposed, like she'd stepped onto a stage without knowing the script. For the first time, the narrative she'd been living in didn't make sense. Nathan wasn't answering. Brian was warning her. And systems, vast, impersonal systems, were beginning to turn their attention her way. Emily had believed signing the agreement would secure her future. She didn't realize it had anchored her to someone else's past. And once anchors set, they were difficult to lift. The call came at 8:17 a.m., just as Emily was stepping into the elevator at work. Miss Martinez, the voice said evenly, this is the compliance team at First Atlantic. We need to speak with you regarding several flagged transactions associated with your accounts. Emily felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She pressed the elevator button again, harder than necessary, and stepped back into the lobby. I've already provided documentation, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. This should be routine. It may be, the voice replied, but we'll need clarification today. There are inconsistencies. The word lodged in her chest. Inconsistencies. She hung up and immediately called Nathan, straight to voicemail. Emily stood there for a long moment, phone in hand, watching coworkers pass with coffee cups and casual laughter, unaware that her world had just narrowed to a single unanswered call. She texted him anyway. Bank compliance is asking questions. Please call me. No response. She went up to her office and shut the door. Her hands shook as she opened her laptop. Another email had arrived, this one. From the bank's AML unit marked time-sensitive. The language was polite, almost apologetic, but firm. They needed explanations for the advisory entity listed on her transfers. They needed confirmation of authorization. They needed to understand her relationship to the named executive contact, Brian Martinez. Emily read the name twice. That couldn't be right. She forwarded the email to Nathan again, adding a single line. Why is my husband listed anywhere on this minutes past? Then 10, then 30. Her phone finally buzzed. Stay calm, Nathan wrote. This is normal when institutions overcorrect. Do not speculate. Let me speak to my people. Your people, Emily typed back. This is my account. Another pause. Across town, Brian sat with Daniel Ross in a quiet conference room, the blinds half drawn. On the screen between them, transaction maps glowed like constellations, lines branching, converging, looping back. "They've noticed," Daniel said. "Not formally, but the inquiries have begun." Brian nodded. "Expected. What she's seeing now is the early stage," Daniel continued. "Banks ask questions. Then regulators ask better ones." Brian exhaled slowly. "Is she exposed?" Daniel didn't soften his answer. "Yes, but not irreversibly. Not yet." Brian's phone buzzed. Emily's name lit the screen. He didn't answer immediately. He waited not out of cruelty, but necessity. Every response now mattered. Words could be misinterpreted. Silence could buy clarity. When he finally answered, her voice broke through before he could speak. "They're asking about you," Emily said. "Your name's on their files." "What does that mean?" Brian closed his eyes. "It means you moved money through systems that intersect with regulated infrastructure." "That doesn't explain why you're involved," she snapped. "You told me you consulted." "That's it. I told you I worked in systems," Brian replied. "I didn't lie." "You withheld," she said bitterly. "Yes," he admitted, "because context matters." She laughed sharply. Context would have been helpful before this. Brian didn't argue. "What exactly are they asking?" Emily read from the email, voice trembling. "They want to know why my spouse is listed as an executive contact, tied to multiple entities. They want to know if I was acting independently or under direction." Brian leaned forward. "Did you tell them anything yet?" "No," she said quickly. "I forwarded everything to Nathan." There it was. Brian felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not anger, but urgency. "Emily," he said carefully, "you need to stop routing communication through him." "He's my advisor," she insisted weakly. "He's protecting himself," Brian replied, "not you." Silence followed. "I didn't know," Emily whispered. "About any of this?" "I know," Brian said. And now she asked, "What happens now?" Before he could answer, Daniel gestured to the screen. A new alert had appeared. "Brian," Daniel said quietly, "they've connected the dots." Brian muted the call for a moment. "How far?" "Far enough," Daniel replied. "They see the advisory layer, they see the authorization, and they see you." Brian nodded. "Proceed." He unmuted. "Emily," he said, voice steady, "you're going to get another call today, possibly from a different department. When you do answer directly, tell the truth. Don't speculate. Don't protect anyone." Her breathing quickened. "Including you, especially me," Brian said. "I can handle scrutiny. He's counting on you to absorb it." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Nathan said this would be fine." "I warned you," Brian replied gently, "about thresholds." She sank into her chair, the weight of realization settling like lead. "Why didn't you stop me?" "I tried," Brian said. "And when you asked me to leave, I lost the ability to intervene without becoming the villain." Another call buzzed through on Emily's line. "Unknown number." "I have to go," she said, panic edging her voice. "I know," Brian replied. "I'll be here." She answered the call, hands trembling. Across the city, Nathan Cole watched his phone in silence. He had known this moment would come, just not this quickly. The restraining order had slowed his options. The inquiries were faster than anticipated. He typed a message, then deleted it. Another. Deleted. The problem wasn't Emily. It was Brian. Nathan had underestimated the man he dismissed as passive. He had assumed Brian's silence meant irrelevance. He had assumed wrong. The phone rang again. This time it was his general counsel. "We have an issue," she said without preamble. "Subpoena requests are being drafted." Quietly, but broadly. Nathan closed his eyes. "On what basis conflict of interest?" she replied. "Unauthorized advisory relationships, potential misrepresentation." "And Emily?" Nathan asked. There was a pause. "She's being viewed as the face, not the architect." Nathan's jaw tightened. "Can we distance?" "Yes," counsel said. "But it won't be clean." Nathan ended the call and stared at the city beyond his window. He had always believed he could step away before consequences landed. He had always counted on intermediaries to take the weight. But intermediaries talked. And systems remembered. Back in her office, Emily ended the compliance call pale and shaking. The questions had been precise, calm, unyielding. They hadn't accused her, but they hadn't reassured her either. She called Brian again. They asked if I understood the advisory agreement, she said. If I understood the risks. And Brian asked. I said I relied on professional guidance, she replied. Brian closed his eyes. That may not be enough. What do I do? She asked, desperation seeping through. For now, Brian said, you stop trusting promises. You start trusting process. She laughed weakly. That sounds like something you'd say. Yes, he replied. Because process is what protects people when stories collapse. Emily looked around her office, the awards, the framed certificates, the carefully curated life she'd built. It all felt suddenly fragile, like props waiting to be removed. I never thought this would happen, she said quietly. Brian's voice softened. Neither did I. But this is where we are. After the call, Brian sat back, the weight of inevitability settling over him. The reveal had begun not with a dramatic announcement, but with a paper trail that refused to be ignored. Emily had believed the truth would arrive like a confrontation. Instead, it arrived like an audit, methodical, impersonal, and impossible to argue with. As the day wore on, emails multiplied. Calls followed. Institutions spoke to one another in careful language, aligning timelines, comparing notes. By evening, the question was no longer whether something was wrong. It was who would be held responsible. Emily sat alone in her apartment that night, staring at the phone that no longer rang. Nathan hadn't replied since noon. Brian's warnings echoed in her mind, sharper now that the ground beneath her was shifting. She had thought she was stepping into a bigger life. She didn't realize she had stepped into a system that never cared about intent, only impact. And the impact was finally being measured. Brian Martinez had never planned to explain himself this way. If he had ever imagined the moment the truth surfaced, it would have been private, measured, chosen, not dragged forward by compliance calls and transaction logs, not under the cold light of institutional scrutiny. But systems didn't wait for readiness. They moved when thresholds were crossed. Brian sat alone in the hotel room, laptop open, secure phone beside him, watching data populate across multiple dashboards. Daniel Ross had warned him years ago that visibility was a double-edged blade. You could hide from people, but not from patterns. And patterns were speaking now. The entities tied to Brian's work, quietly registered, rigorously compliant, were surfacing because Emily's transfers had brushed against them. Not because Brian had done anything wrong, but because he had built infrastructure that other people used. Custody frameworks, security layers, transaction validation systems designed to withstand scrutiny precisely like this. Emily's money hadn't gone into Brian's world. It had passed near it. That proximity was enough. Brian's phone rang. Laura Bennett. They're escalating, she said without preamble. Still preliminary, but the inquiries are formalizing. Brian nodded. I expected that. You're listed as an executive contact across multiple filings, Laura continued. That's raising eyebrows. Because it should, Brian replied. Transparency was the point. Laura paused. Emily doesn't seem to understand the scale of what you're connected to. Brian closed his eyes briefly. She never asked. Laura softened her tone. Are you prepared for what happens when she finds out I am? Brian said. I'm not sure she is. They ended the call and Brian leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His mind drifted, not to regret, but memory. He remembered the first system he'd helped build years ago after leaving a promising corporate role. It wasn't glamorous. It was infrastructure, secure wallets, compliance rails, audit trails so clean they could survive hostile examination. He'd watched friends chase headlines and quick exits only to implode when markets turned or regulators knocked. Brian had chosen a different path. Quiet, durable, boring by design. He co-founded entities that never advertised. He stayed off panels. He declined interviews. His name appeared on filings, not articles. He believed longevity mattered more than recognition. And when money followed, as it inevitably did, he made a conscious choice. He lived small, not because he lacked ambition, but because he had seen what sudden wealth did to relationships, to trust, to people who loved the idea of success more than the person behind it. Emily had fallen in love with his calm. She had grown resentful of it. Brian didn't blame her entirely. The world rewarded visibility. It praised motion. It equated noise with progress. His restraint looked like stagnation to someone chasing momentum. The phone buzzed again. This time it was Emily. He answered. "I just got another email," she said, voice strained. "They're asking if I was aware of your role in these entities." Brian inhaled slowly. "What did you tell them I said I didn't know?" she replied. "Because I didn't." That was the right answer, Brian said. There was a pause. "Brian, what is it you actually do?" He closed his eyes. "I design systems," he said carefully, "for digital asset custody, security frameworks that institutions use so money doesn't disappear." Her breath caught. "Institutions, yes, you're saying. Crypto?" she asked, disbelief creeping in. "Yes," Brian replied, "but not speculation. Infrastructure." She laughed weakly. "I thought you hated that world." "I hate chaos," Brian said. "I don't hate tools." Silence stretched between them. "You could have told me," Emily said finally. "I planned to," Brian replied. "When it was safe." "Safe from what?" "From exactly this," he said. "From people seeing you differently, treating you differently, expecting things from you because of me." Her voice wavered. "You didn't trust me," Brian answered honestly. "I trusted your heart. I didn't trust the pressure around you." That stung. "So you decided for me," she said. "I decided to protect what we had," Brian replied. "Or what I thought we had." Emily swallowed hard. "Nathan knew something, didn't he?" "Yes," Brian said. "Enough to be dangerous." Her voice trembled. "He never told me." "No," Brian agreed. "He let you sign." Tears slid down her cheeks. "I thought I was finally choosing strength." Brian's voice softened. "You were choosing approval." The line went quiet. Brian could hear her breathing ragged, uneven. "I feel stupid," she whispered. "You're not," Brian said. "You were manipulated." "And you?" she asked bitterly. "What are you now?" The Brian considered the question. "I'm accountable." "For what?" "For building something that requires scrutiny," he replied. "And for not realizing how alone you felt before someone else noticed." That was the truth he hadn't wanted to say out loud. Another call interrupted them. "Unknown number." "That's probably them," Brian said. "Answer." "I'm scared," Emily admitted. "I know," Brian replied. "But fear doesn't mean guilt. It means attention." She hung up. Brian stared at the darkened screen, knowing the moment had shifted. The truth was no longer a secret. It was a variable in motion. Later that evening, Daniel Ross called. "They're connecting you to the advisory layer," Daniel said. "Not as a suspect, as context." "That's fine," Brian replied. "I have nothing to hide." "You do have influence," Daniel cautioned. "And influence makes regulators curious." Brian nodded. "Curiosity is better than assumptions." Daniel hesitated. "There's something else." "Nathan Cole's counsel has begun distancing." Brian's jaw tightened. "Meaning emails reframed. Authorizations emphasized. Responsibility redirected." To Emily, Brian said quietly. "Yes." Brian closed his eyes. The pattern was completing itself exactly as he'd feared. That night, Emily called again. "He won't answer me," she said. "Nathan. His office says he's unavailable." Brian said nothing. "They asked if I was acting under his direction," she continued. "If I benefited personally." "And what did you say?" Brian asked. "I told them I trusted him," she replied. "That I thought he was protecting me." Brian exhaled slowly. "That may be the most important thing you've said." "Why? Because it establishes intent," Brian replied. "And intent matters." She was quiet for a long moment. "If I had known who you were, would any of this have happened?" Brian didn't answer right away. "Maybe," he said finally. "Or maybe it would have happened faster." She let out a soft, broken laugh. So I lose either way. No, Brian said. You lose if you don't learn. The words hung there, not as judgment, but invitation. Outside, the city hummed with its usual indifference. Lights flickered on in office towers. Lives continued uninterrupted by the quiet unraveling taking place behind closed doors. Brian stood by the window, watching reflections blur across the glass. He had built his life around minimizing damage, through systems, through silence, through restraint. But restraint had limits. Now the truth was moving through channels he couldn't control. Courts would interpret it. Institutions would measure it. Emily would have to face it. And Brian would stand in it. Not as a hero, not as a victim, but as the man who understood, perhaps too late, that protecting someone without their consent could look a lot like distance. And distance, once misunderstood, had consequences. The courtroom was smaller than Emily had imagined. No grand chandeliers, no dramatic audience, just polished wood-muted flags and a judge whose expression revealed nothing. This was not the place where stories won. It was where records spoke. Emily sat beside her attorney, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed forward. Brian sat across the aisle with Laura Bennett, posture composed, attention focused. He didn't look at Emily, not out of bitterness, but discipline. Anything that could be read as performance had no place here. The hearing was procedural, temporary orders, asset protection, clarification of authority. The language was dry, precise, almost indifferent to the emotional wreckage beneath it. Laura spoke first. Your Honor, she said calmly, we are requesting a narrowly tailored financial injunction to preserve marital assets and prevent further unilateral exposure while discovery proceeds. The judge nodded. Grounds. Laura didn't raise her voice. Documented third-party influence, undisclosed delegation of authority, and regulatory inquiries that elevate risk. Emily felt her chest tighten. None of it was exaggerated. None of it was softened. Her attorney stood. My client has acted in good faith. She relied on professional advice. Laura met his gaze. Advice is not authority, and reliance does not erase responsibility. The judge leaned forward. I'll hear evidence. Daniel Ross took the stand. He did not dramatize. He explained. Transaction flows, authorization layers, the difference between access and control. The moment delegation crossed from administrative to substantive. He spoke like a teacher, not an accuser. Emily watched the judge's pen pause, then move again. When Brian was called, the room shifted. He didn't posture. He answered questions directly. Yes, he was listed as an executive contact. Yes, that role existed for regulatory clarity. No, he had not advised Emily on the transactions in question. Yes, he had warned against unsupervised delegation. Why didn't you intervene more forcefully? The judge asked. Brian didn't hesitate. Because coercive intervention during a marital dispute can itself create legal and ethical risk. I chose documentation over confrontation. The judge studied him. That's unusual. Brian met her gaze. So is the situation. The injunction was granted limited, precise. No further unilateral transfers. Full disclosure required. Discovery authorized. Emily felt both relief and dread settle over her at once. Outside the courtroom, her attorney spoke quietly. This protects you for now, but discovery will be uncomfortable. I know, Emily said. Across the hall, Brian stood with Laura. You handled that well, she said. It wasn't about handling, Brian replied. It was about accuracy. As they spoke, a process server approached Nathan Cole in the lobby. He accepted the envelope with practiced neutrality, but his jaw tightened when he saw the header. Subpoena. Inside were requests, communications, advisory agreements, compensation structures. Quiet questions that carried weight. Nathan's attorney called within minutes. They're casting a wide net, she said. And your name is in the center. I can explain, Nathan replied. You can contextualize, counsel corrected. Explanation implies control. Context implies influence. Choose carefully. That evening, Emily met Brian in a neutral office, glass walls, quiet hum of air conditioning. Laura and Emily's attorney sat a respectful distance away, not participating unless needed. Emily spoke first. "I testified truthfully," she said. "I didn't protect him." Brian nodded. "That matters." She swallowed. "I'm scared." "I know," Brian said. She looked up at him. "I thought power looked like certainty, confidence, momentum." Brian's voice was steady. "Power looks like accountability when momentum stops." Emily nodded slowly. Over the next weeks, discovery unfolded methodically. Emails, texts, calendars, compensation disclosures. The advisory agreement Emily had signed revealed layers indemnification clauses that shifted risk downward communication channels that bypassed internal compliance. Nathan's counsel attempted to frame it as industry standard. Regulators were not persuaded. They asked better questions. Why was Emily positioned as principal decision-maker without operational authority? Why were advisory fees structured to increase with opacity? Why were warnings routed away from her and toward Nathan metadata answered when people would not? Nathan requested a private meeting with Brian. Brian declined. Anything said outside counsel could distort timelines. Brian had no interest in private reckonings. Emily received notice from her employer administrative leave, pending review. She sat in her apartment staring at the email, the finality of it settling in. Brian called that night. "I heard," he said. "I didn't ask you to fix it," she replied. "I know," Brian said. "I'm calling because you shouldn't be alone with this." They spoke quietly, about logistics, about next steps, about boundaries. The conversation was careful adult, nothing like the arguments they once had. Nathan's position deteriorated quickly after that. The subpoena expanded. Internal audit findings surfaced. A pattern emerged, not criminal in isolation, but damning in aggregation. Pressure mounted. Settlement talks began. Nathan's counsel approached Emily's attorney with a proposal distance cooperation mitigation. Emily listened as it was explained, then shook her head. "I'm not shielding him." Her attorney nodded. "That will increase your exposure." "I understand," Emily said, "but I won't lie." When Brian heard, he closed his eyes briefly, not in triumph, but relief. This was the moment that mattered. Not revenge, not revelation, choice. At the next hearing, the judge acknowledged cooperation. Emily's exposure narrowed. Nathan's widened. Outside, the press gathered not aggressively, but attentively. A story was forming, careful not to sensationalize, but impossible to ignore. Brian did not appear. He never intended to. Emily watched from a distance as Nathan's name became associated with phrases he once avoided: investigation, scrutiny, oversight. The confidence that once defined him looked brittle under examination. One evening, Emily sat alone and reread a message Brian had sent weeks earlier. Process protects people when stories collapse. She finally understood it. Process didn't care who was charming. It didn't reward confidence. It didn't respond to fear. It measured actions. As winter edged toward spring, the trajectory became clear. The marriage would not survive. But something else might. Emily met Brian one final time before mediation. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I just want to say I see it now." Brian nodded. Seeing is the beginning, not the end. She hesitated. "Did you ever think this would happen?" "No," he replied. "But I prepared for the possibility." She smiled faintly. "You always did." They stood not as enemies, not as partners, but as two people who had reached the end of a shared system. And, as the legal machinery continued its quiet work, one truth had fully emerged. Justice rarely arrives with spectacle. It arrives with paperwork. Emily Martinez had always believed that clarity would feel like relief. Instead, it felt like grief. Administrative leave stretched into weeks. Friends stopped calling, not out of cruelty, but uncertainty. No one knew what to say to someone whose life had become a cautionary headline, whispered in conference rooms. Emily filled her days with practical tasks, documents meetings with counsel, compliance interviews, but the quiet hours were the hardest. They were when the story she had told herself finally unraveled. She began to see the pattern, not as a series of isolated mistakes, but as a slow erosion of judgment fueled by insecurity. Nathan hadn't forced her. He hadn't threatened her. He had done something far more effective. He had validated her doubts and framed them as insight. Once she saw that she couldn't unsee it. Her attorney laid out options with professional neutrality. Cooperation could narrow exposure. Silence could widen it. Settlements were discussed in conditional language, if pending subject to review. Emily listened, asked questions, took notes. She was learning to operate without fantasy. One afternoon, she requested a meeting with Brian, formal, mediated, scheduled through counsel. When they sat across from each other in the neutral conference room, Emily noticed how different he seemed. Not hardened, not triumphant, simply aligned. "I want to be clear," she said. "I'm not asking you to save me." Brian nodded. "Good. I'm asking for context," she continued, "about what comes next." Brian folded his hands. "Next is accountability. Yours and mine. Mine is mostly procedural. Yours is personal and legal." She swallowed. "Do you think I can recover?" Brian considered the question. "Recovery isn't a return. It's a reconfiguration." Emily let that settle. "I don't want to be who I was becoming." "That's a decision," Brian said, "not a feeling." They spoke about practicalities, mediation timelines, asset division, frameworks, the injunction's scope. Brian was precise fair. He did not punish. He did not posture. Emily realized painfully that this was the man she had mistaken for small. After the meeting, Emily received a message from Nathan. It was the first in weeks. "We need to align before this goes further." She stared at the screen, heart steady now, in a way it hadn't been before. She forwarded the message to her attorney without replying. Minutes later, another message arrived. "You're overreacting. This can be contained." Emily closed her eyes and typed a single sentence: "Do not contact me again." She blocked the number. The next days brought interviews, careful, recorded, methodical. Emily answered honestly. She described her reliance, her assumptions, the moments she had ignored warning signs because acknowledging them would have shattered the image she was chasing. The interviewers didn't judge. They documented. And documentation, Emily was learning, was a kind of mercy. Nathan's counsel reached out again this time, proposing a joint narrative that minimized individual culpability. Emily declined. Her attorney warned her it could complicate negotiations. "I understand," Emily said, "but I won't be managed anymore." That choice narrowed some options and strengthened others. When the next hearing convened, the judge acknowledged cooperation on the record. Emily's exposure narrowed further, not erased, but clarified. Nathan's widened. The courtroom remained quiet, efficient, unmoved by the emotional significance of the shift. Outside, Emily felt lighter and heavier all at once. She began therapy not as a performative step, but a necessary one. She learned to name the discomfort she had avoided for years, the fear of being ordinary, the hunger for external validation, the belief that worth was measured by proximity to power. Her therapist didn't excuse her actions. She helped her understand them. Meanwhile, Brian moved through his own reckoning. He reviewed years of choices through a new lens, not to regret them, but to assess their cost. Privacy had protected his work. It had not protected his marriage. He accepted that trade-off without self-pity. In mediation, he proposed a division that surprised Emily's attorney for its restraint. No hidden leverage, no punitive terms, just fairness. Emily looked at the document and shook her head. "You don't have to do this." "I know," Brian said. "I'm choosing to." She searched his face. "Why?" "Because justice isn't subtraction," he replied. "It's balance." The settlement progressed. Nathan's situation did not, as regulators deepened their inquiry patterns surfaced that no framing could neutralize. Advisory structures designed to diffuse accountability. Communications routed to avoid audit triggers. Incentives misaligned with fiduciary duty. None of it was explosive alone. Together, it was unmistakable. Emily watched from a distance as the man she once admired recalibrated his tone from confident to careful. to constrained. The charm that had once felt reassuring now read as evasive. She felt no satisfaction, only clarity. On a quiet evening, Emily and Brian met once more, this time without attorneys, in a public place, with daylight and witnesses. They spoke about ordinary things, the weather schedule's logistics. The ease surprised them both. "I'm sorry," Emily said finally, not as a tactic, as a statement. Brian nodded. "I accept the apology. I don't accept the premise that it fixes everything." She smiled faintly. "Fair." They stood to leave. "Brian," she said, "if you could go back, would you tell me sooner?" He considered. "I would tell you differently." She frowned. "How I would ask better questions," he said, "and listen harder to the answers." Emily nodded, understanding. As spring arrived, the case moved toward resolution. Emily prepared for consequences she could live with. Brian prepared for a future quieter and truer than the one he'd protected. They did not reconcile. They did not vilify each other. They recalibrated. In the end, Emily's awakening did not come with absolution or applause. It came with humility, responsibility, and a refusal to be used again. And Brian, steady, deliberate, watched the system do what it was built to do, not destroy, but reveal. The second courtroom felt even smaller than the first. Not because the room had changed, but because illusion no longer filled the space. There were no imagined outcomes left, no secret hopes of clever reversals or last-minute rescues. Only documents, sworn statements, and a judge who had read everything twice. Emily sat straighter this time. Not defensive, not frozen, present. Across the aisle, Brian sat with Laura Bennett, hands folded, eyes forward. He looked the same as he always had, calm, restrained, but something about him felt more solid now, as if the ground beneath his feet had finally settled. This hearing wasn't about emergency orders or preservation. It was about responsibility. The judge began without ceremony. "We are here to address the advisory relationship authorization chain and financial representations made during the period under review." Emily's attorney nodded. Brian's attorney nodded. Nathan Cole's chair remained empty. His counsel was present instead. That absence spoke louder than any argument. Daniel Ross was called again, this time to walk the court through what he referred to as the paper trail. No slides this time, just binders. Tabbed, indexed, methodical. "This is not about intent," Daniel said calmly. "It's about sequence." He laid it out with clinical precision. The initial access changes, the advisory introduction, the delegation agreement, the rerouted communications, the indemnification clause. Each step alone looked reasonable. Together they formed a funnel. Who benefited, the judge asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. The advisory entity, structurally and financially. And who bore the risk? Daniel glanced briefly at Emily, then back to the judge. "Miss Martinez." Nathan's attorney stood. "Objection. My client did not coerce." The judge raised a hand. "Sit. This court understands coercion. We are discussing influence." Silence followed. Emily felt her heart beat steadily in her chest, not from fear, but from recognition. This was the moment where truth no longer needed her to defend it. Brian was called next. "Mr. Martinez," the judge said, "you are listed as an executive contact for several regulated entities." Why, Brian answered evenly. "Because regulators require accountability. Someone must be reachable, knowledgeable, and willing to respond under scrutiny." "And you accepted that role?" "Yes." "Did you advise your spouse on these transactions?" "No." "Did you benefit financially from them?" "No." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Why not disclose your role earlier?" Brian paused, not to calculate, but to choose accuracy. "Because disclosure changes behavior," he said. "And I wanted my marriage to be built on who I was, not what I controlled." The judge studied him for a long moment. "That choice had consequences," she said. "Yes," Brian replied. "I accept that." Emily was then called. Her voice did not shake. She described her assumptions, her reliance, the moments she ignored discomfort because it conflicted with the image she wanted to inhabit. She did not excuse herself. She did not dramatize. "I signed what I didn't fully understand," she said, "and I trusted someone who benefited from that gap." Nathan's counsel rose again. "Miss Martinez, are you suggesting my client intended harm?" Emily met his gaze. "I'm suggesting intent is irrelevant when incentives are misaligned." The judge nodded once. That was enough. The ruling came later in writing, but its direction was clear. Emily's exposure was narrowed, not erased, but contextualized. Cooperation noted. Responsibility acknowledged. Mitigation warranted. Nathan's situation was referred onward, not with outrage, with inevitability. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited at a respectful distance. No shouting, no spectacle. This was not a scandal, it was a process, and process rarely fed drama. Brian declined to comment. Emily spoke briefly. "I made mistakes," she said. "I'm addressing them." That was all. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded quietly. Emily's company completed its internal review. She was not reinstated, but she was not publicly censured either. A separation agreement, a closed chapter. She accepted it without protest. Nathan's advisory contracts unraveled under scrutiny. Boards distanced themselves. Language shifted from visionary to review pending. The charm that once opened doors now raised eyebrows. Brian finalized the divorce settlement. It was fair, balanced, unembellished. When Emily reviewed the final terms, she exhaled slowly. "You could have asked for more." "I didn't want more," Brian said. She nodded. "I used to think that meant you lacked ambition." Brian smiled faintly. "I just define ambition differently." They signed. No dramatics, no last-minute pleas, just ink. On the day the settlement was finalized, Emily returned to the apartment one last time to collect what remained. She paused in the doorway, remembering the night she'd told Brian to leave, how sure she'd been, how righteous. She felt no anger now, only understanding. Across town, Brian sat in his new office, smaller, quieter, intentional. He reviewed a compliance report, responded to a regulator's inquiry, closed his laptop, and allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. The system had done its work. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but honestly. Emily's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She didn't answer it. She deleted it without reading. That alone felt like progress. As summer approached, the story faded from whispers to memory. New headlines replaced old ones. Institutions moved on. But the lessons remained. For Emily, power no longer looked like proximity to influence. It looked like discernment, like restraint, like the courage to say no, even when saying yes promised applause. For Brian, justice did not feel like victory. It felt like alignment. The paper trail had spoken. And when paper speaks clearly enough, even the loudest narratives fall silent. The consequences did not arrive with sirens. They arrived with calendars. Regulators didn't storm offices or issue dramatic statements. They scheduled meetings. They sent follow-up letters. They asked for additional documentation. And with each request, the margin for interpretation narrowed. Nathan Cole felt it first in the silence. Calls that once returned immediately now went unanswered. Invitations softened into, "We'll circle back." Board members requested distance, not publicly, but deliberately. The tone shifted from admiration to liability assessment, and Nathan understood what that meant. This was not a fall. It was a constriction. His counsel advised cooperation, but also containment. "You need to be precise," she said. "Every word now lives forever." Nathan nodded, listening carefully, but the instinct that had carried him this far, the instinct to manage perception, refused to quiet. He believed he could still shape the narrative if he acted quickly enough. He drafted an email to Emily. He didn't send it. Instead, he sent one to Brian. "We should talk, privately. There are misunderstandings that can be resolved." Brian read the message once and forwarded it to Laura without comment. There would be no private conversations. At the regulatory level, the inquiry matured. What had begun as transactional review became structural assessment. Patterns were charted, incentives mapped, Advisors interviewed separately, then together. One question kept recurring. Who benefited when accountability was unclear? The answer repeated itself in different language. Not Emily, not Brian, Nathan. Emily learned this not from headlines, but from her attorney's careful updates. Each call was factual restraint. Progress measured not in wins, but in narrowing scope. Your cooperation is noted, her attorney said during one update. It matters. Emily absorbed that quietly. She had stopped hoping for absolution. What she wanted now was proportionality consequences that reflected her actions, not her fears. Brian watched the process from a distance. He continued his work, responded to regulator inquiries, participated when required, and declined when appropriate. He did not seek visibility. He did not exploit the moment to assert superiority. His reputation among compliance professionals shifted subtly from unknown to reliable. That was enough. Nathan's situation accelerated when metadata did what testimony could not. Communication surfaced, showing how advisory language shifted, depending on audience. Risk was minimized to clients and emphasized internally. Compensation structures rewarded opacity. Warnings were routed away from those who needed them most. None of it was theatrical. It was damning. Nathan's counsel requested a settlement conference. Regulators agreed. The meeting was closed door. No press, no spectacle. Just timelines, obligations, and consequences. Emily was not invited. She didn't need to be. When the outcome reached her weeks later, it arrived in the form of a summary: restrictions imposed, roles terminated, oversight mandated. Not prison, not public humiliation, but removal. Nathan Cole would no longer operate in the space where he once thrived. Emily read the summary twice, then set it down. She felt no satisfaction, only closure. That evening, she met Brian one final time before the divorce decree became absolute. It was a brief meeting, procedural in nature, but she lingered as they stood to leave. I know this doesn't fix anything, she said, but thank you for not destroying me when you could have. Brian considered her words carefully. Justice isn't destruction, he said. It's containment. She nodded. I didn't understand that before. He offered a small, genuine smile. Most people don't, until they have to. They parted without ceremony. As summer deepened, Emily rebuilt her life deliberately. She downsized. She took a consulting role that paid less but demanded honesty. She stayed away from rooms that felt impressive and leaned into ones that felt real. Therapy continued. Silence became less threatening. She learned to ask different questions. What am I avoiding? Who benefits if I don't ask this? What does responsibility look like when no one is watching? Brian, meanwhile, made a decision of his own. He stepped back from the executive contact role he had held for years, not under pressure, but by choice. He helped transition responsibilities, documented processes, and left the system stronger than he had found it. Anonymity had protected him. Alignment would sustain him. On the day he submitted his final handoff, a regulator emailed him directly. Thank you for your cooperation. Your clarity saved time. Brian closed the laptop and sat quietly for a moment. Clarity. It had cost him his marriage. It had protected him from becoming someone else. He accepted both truths. News of Nathan's removal never became a headline. It surfaced briefly in trade publications, then vanished beneath fresher stories. That too felt fitting. Systems corrected quietly when allowed to. Emily read one such article months later and closed it without emotion. She had moved on. The divorce decree arrived in the mail on an ordinary Tuesday. No drama, no final confrontation, just a document marking the end of a shared structure that no longer held. Emily placed it in a folder and labeled it simply closed. Brian received his copy the same day. He read it once, then filed it away. That evening, he took a walk through his neighborhood, new, modest, intentional. He passed families, small shops, quiet streets. Life continued. He did not feel triumphant. He felt steady. Justice had arrived without violence, without spectacle, without humiliation. It had arrived through patience, intelligence, and the willingness to let process do its work. Emily, in her smaller apartment, poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The city lights looked different now, not like a stage, but a grid of lives unfolding independently of her expectations. She thought of the question Brian had once asked her, long before everything collapsed. Do you know who you're trusting? She finally did. And that knowledge, earned painfully honestly, was something no one could take from her. The last hearing ended without speeches. No closing arguments meant for memory. No dramatic pauses. Just a judge reviewing the final stipulations, confirming compliance, and setting the record straight in a voice that carried neither judgment nor sympathy, only resolution. Terms are accepted, she said. The matter is concluded. A gavel tapped once. That was it. Emily Martinez sat still for a moment after everyone else began to move. She felt the familiar urge to search the room for meaning, some sign that this ending was supposed to feel larger than it did. But the room offered none. Resolution, she was learning, did not announce itself. It simply arrived. Outside, the steps were warm with late summer sun. Emily stood there, breathing in the ordinary sounds of the city traffic, footsteps, distant laughter. Life had not paused for her reckoning. That realization no longer hurt. It grounded her. Brian Martinez exited a few minutes later, Laura Bennett beside him. They exchanged brief words, procedural, professional. When Laura left, Brian remained as if sensing that this was a moment that deserved stillness. Emily approached him. Thank you, she said, not reflexively, not out of habit. Deliberately. Brian nodded. You handled the end with integrity. She managed a small smile. I learned the hard way that integrity isn't a performance. They stood in silence, the past no longer pressing between them, the future not yet demanding attention. Emily broke the quiet. I used to think dignity meant never backing down. Brian looked at her. Dignity is knowing when to stop pretending. She nodded, absorbing the truth of it. I don't expect forgiveness, she said, or understanding. I just wanted to say, I see the difference now, between power and control. Brian considered this. Power reveals, control conceals. She exhaled. That's what I chased. Control. I told myself it was ambition. Ambition isn't the problem, Brian said. Confusing it with worth is. They parted there, no embrace, no bitterness. Just two people acknowledging the end of a shared structure and the beginning of separate ones. Emily's life after the case did not resemble the one she had once imagined. She moved to a smaller place with fewer mirrors and more windows. She took on consulting work that required transparency rather than polish. She declined invitations that felt impressive and accepted ones that felt honest. She learned to sit with discomfort without anesthetizing it with validation. Some days were heavier than others. Accountability did not disappear when paperwork ended. But she found something steadier beneath the weight self-respect earned rather than performed. She stopped explaining herself to people who wanted a story. She started listening to the quiet questions that came before decisions. Brian, for his part, restructured his work with intention. He reduced scope, increased clarity, and transferred responsibilities he no longer needed to hold. He accepted advisory roles that valued restraint. He declined opportunities that promised visibility without stewardship. He learned to articulate boundaries earlier. He learned that protection without communication could become distance. But he did not regret the choices he had made. He understood now that dignity required trade-offs, and that some losses were the cost of alignment. One evening, months later, Emily found herself sorting through old files when she came across a photo from years ago. It showed her and Brian standing in a crowded room, both smiling awkwardly younger and unguarded. She studied it for a long time. They had not failed because of a single betrayal. They had failed because they stopped asking each other the right questions. She placed the photo back in the box and closed it gently. Across the city, Brian sat at his desk reviewing a final compliance report before sending it off. He paused, then added a note brief, precise, clarifying a risk that had not been flagged. When he hit send, he felt a familiar sense of quiet satisfaction. Not pride, completion. Later that night, Brian walked through his neighborhood, the air cooling as dusk settled in. He passed a cafe where a couple argued softly over nothing that would matter in 10 years. He passed a bookstore closing for the evening, its lights dimming. Ordinary moments, real ones. He did not miss the life he had lost. He respected it. Emily, too, found herself standing at a window that night, watching the city settle into sleep. She thought of the question that had once haunted her. What kind of life do I want? And realized how incomplete it had been. The better question had always been, who do I want to be when no one is watching? She had her answer now. The story that began with secrets and misjudgment ended without triumph or punishment. No one was destroyed. No one was exalted. Justice had arrived in its most mature form. Measured, proportionate, quiet. Brian Martinez did not reclaim his marriage. He reclaimed his alignment. Emily Martinez did not escape consequence. She reclaimed her agency. And in that space, free of illusions, stripped of performance, both of them discovered something sturdier than revenge or regret. They discovered dignity, not as an outcome, but as a choice made repeatedly when the noise finally fades. When everything finally settles, what remains is rarely the money, the status, or the version of ourselves we once tried so hard to protect. What remains is the truth we were avoiding and the person we become once we stop running from it. This story is not really about crypto wealth or betrayal. It's about how easily silence can be mistaken for weakness and how often noise disguises itself as strength. Brian never lacked ambition. He lacked the desire to be seen for the wrong reasons. Emily didn't set out to destroy her marriage. She slowly traded honesty for validation, convincing herself that momentum mattered more than integrity. Neither of them was evil. Both of them were human. And that is what makes this story painful and real. One of the hardest lessons in life is realizing that being trusted is not the same as being respected, and being admired is not the same as being safe. People who move loudly often look powerful. People who move quietly are often carrying weight we don't see. When we judge others by appearances alone, we risk underestimating the very people who are holding everything together. Another truth is even harder. Accountability is not punishment, it's clarity. Emily's growth didn't begin when she was forgiven. It began when she stopped outsourcing responsibility for her choices. Brian's dignity wasn't proven by winning or humiliating anyone. It was proven by restraint, by choosing fairness over revenge, process over spectacle, and alignment over ego. Life doesn't always offer second chances in the way we expect. Sometimes the gift is not reconciliation, but awakening. Not restoration, but direction. And sometimes losing what we thought we needed is the only way to find who we really are. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see something differently about trust, ambition, marriage, or yourself, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Where are you watching from, and what part of this story stayed with you the most? And if you believe stories like this matter, stories that choose depth over drama, truth over noise, consider subscribing to the channel. Not for entertainment alone, but as a quiet reminder that integrity, patience, and self-awareness still have a place in a very loud world.